You're listening to the Decisive Podcast, insights and analysis to empower confident decision-making. The following episode was recorded on June 5th, before Israel initiated military operations in Iran on June 13th. Welcome to the Decisive Podcast, brought to you by S&P Global Market Intelligence. I'm your host, Kristen Hallam. In this episode, we're discussing the risk landscape in the Middle East, North Africa, or MENA region, following U.S. President Donald Trump's visit to the region in May. Joining me for this discussion from Market Intelligence are Jacob Weiss and Kevjn Lim. Jacob is a senior analyst and Kevjn is a principal analyst on our Middle East and North Africa country risk team. Welcome to the podcast, Jacob and Kevjn. It is great to have you on the Decisive. Let's start by talking about the ongoing nuclear negotiations with Iran. Kevjn, what is the deadline for that, and what do we think the outlook will be?
Thanks. Our position so far has been that the US and Iran are both clearly motivated to reach a deal to avoid military conflicts and are likely to do so, even if not a fully delineated deal before the October 2025 snapback deadline. Any successful deal would probably involve the US conceding some minimal level of uranium enrichment to Iran indigenously, on Iranian territory that is, for the purposes of electricity generation, and would as such probably be similar to the original JCPOA agreement, and also probably with constraint clauses that run for much longer period of time or permanently. Look, rather than a strict deadline, think of this as several clocks ticking at the same time. So the first clock is legal contractual and has to do with the 2015 nuclear agreement, also known as JCPOA, or the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action. On the 18th of October of this year, most of the JCPOA's remaining clauses will expire. The critical one relevant to our conversation is a mechanism that can be invoked by existing signatories to the agreement for the snapback of all international nuclear-related sanctions that had been in place on Iran. We don't think Russia and China, the other two signatories, are likely at all to invoke this mechanism. The Europeans have suggested, or European officials from Britain, France, and Germany have suggested that they would consider invoking snapback by perhaps around August this year if no progress was in evidence between Iran and the US. Snapback of sanctions will be a sanctions doomsday, so to speak, for Iran, which will want to do everything in its power to avoid it. Israeli officials have threatened to strike Iran, including amid the ongoing US-Iran talks. The Netanyahu government in Israel is unlikely, we think, to openly go against the Trump presidency in this regard, specifically, given Israel would also probably need US support in any strike campaign. Now, the second clock is a military one and relates to Israel's perception of a roughly one-year window. There are Israeli officials who've argued that now, or this period, is the most propitious time to strike Iran's nuclear facilities while Iran is weak, from October 2024, when it conducted airstrikes that neutralized Iran's most advanced air defenses, after very significantly degrading Iran's key regional allies, particularly targeting underground facilities in Iran. And Israel would probably also need US's assistance in air defenses in the event of another large-scale Iranian missile counterattack. However, we think the Trump presidency will probably maintain some flexibility if it believes that an alternative nuclear agreement is likely. There's been talk of a possible interim agreement that sets down the broader principles on paper to give time for a more detailed final agreement.
All right. Thank you, Kevjn, for that clear and concise analysis of the situation. You mentioned Israel there, so I think that's a good segue into my next question, which is for Jacob. It seems like there's daylight emerging between the Trump administration and the Israeli government. Do we think this will have an impact on the re-escalation of the war between Israel and Hamas?
Well, we don't think that Trump's recent trip to the MENA region, which didn't include a visit to Israel, was in itself indicative of policy disagreement on the Iran-US nuclear negotiations. And that's not to say that there aren't policy differences. There are. Israel's position under Netanyahu has consistently been against any agreement that did not result in the complete dismantling of Iran's nuclear infrastructure, as well as Netanyahu has been very much publicly against sanction relief, stating that it would provide Iran with the financial capability to increase payments to its proxy militias in the Middle East. Whereas from what has been made public regarding the US position during recent negotiations is that the US is not currently pursuing the total and irreversible dismantling of Iran's nuclear program, but allowing Iran to keep at least some level of civilian nuclear program, albeit very much tightly controlled and monitored. However, despite these apparent policy disagreements, our assessment remains, as Kevjn said, that Israel is just unlikely to strike Iran's nuclear infrastructure unilaterally, while the US still believes there is value in continuing negotiations. And this is because any Israeli strike on Iran's nuclear infrastructure will likely need US backing to maximize the utility of that strike. US backing greatly enhances the impact of an air campaign targeting Iran's nuclear facilities, especially those facilities located deep underground, and it also increases the likelihood of Iranian targeting of US military bases in the Gulf, thus bringing the US into a regional conflict rather than Israel being left to face the repercussions alone. Therefore, from an Israeli perspective, it is likely deemed preferable to leave the US and Iran to negotiate, and in the continued absence of a deal or interim nuclear deal, though we think the US will become more and more receptive to the proposal of a joint Israel-US strike on Iran. And I think if a strike were to occur, we would also likely see some pretty clear indicators of preparations for that strike, most likely in the form of the US moving additional air defense systems and strike carrier groups closer to the Gulf. But to go back to Trump's MENA tour and the prospect for escalation in Gaza, I mean, it's very likely that the primary purpose of that visit was to pursue Trump's Middle East foreign policy priorities of trade, of deals, investment, and economic cooperation. A stop in Israel during that time would not have likely aligned with those objectives at that time, as discussions would have likely revolved around Gaza and Iran, topics that would likely have complicated the US's relations and immediate ability to pursue bilateral deals with Gulf states, whose stated positions differ quite significantly with that of Israel on Iran and Gaza. Regarding the US position on the Gaza conflict, yes, we may have seen increased US pressure to allow aid entry into Gaza, but we're certainly not at a stage where we're seeing the US imposing maximalist ultimatums on Israel along the lines of either you, Israel, agree to a ceasefire on Gaza, or US, we stop military aid or diplomatic support, or we don't aid any strike on Iran's nuclear infrastructure. That's just not the case. Policy disagreements on the Iran nuclear program or the lack of an Israeli visit on Trump's recent MENA tour will have a meaningful impact on conflict re-escalation or de-escalation in Gaza.
Thank you for sharing your insights on that, Jacob. Kevjn, let's come back to you. One area where there appears to be a fairly seismic shift, and one that also seems to be a divergence between Israel and the U.S., is around Syria. What is our outlook for the transitional government there, and how much of an impact would U.S. sanctions relief be?
Yeah, sure. Thanks for the question. I mean, this is a really big question. We think the Syrian Transitional Government has a real shot to essentially put the country back together, pick up the pieces. At the same time, foreign, especially Western and to an extent Gulf support, GCC support, will also depend on how Syrian President Ahmad al-Sharah's administration governs. And an administration faces enormous domestic challenges and is unlikely to resolve them, we think, through the rest of this year. Now, the US, the EU, the UK, and others lifting sanctions will help increase confidence in foreign investment and economic/political re-engagement. But they are contingent also on how the Syrian government shapes policy, including in respect of minorities, political inclusivity, civic freedoms, and Syria's regional neighbors. And if Sunni Islamist and jihadist ideology, which through the country's civil war has been or had been the bedrock of the new government's dominant factions, if that is going to dominate public life, so that really is an open question that hasn't yet been resolved. We're seeing financial support, for instance, Qatar in paying public sector salaries, both Qatar and Saudi Arabia in paying off Syria's debt to the World Bank, and commitments of funding support from the European Union. An urgent priority for Syria would be rehabilitating its power grid, the national power grid. current provision levels are at roughly a fifth or just under of pre-war power provision capacity, and this would be a necessary condition to industrial or economic rehabilitation down the road. Foreign companies engaging with Syria are probably going to be skewed more towards MENA than the West, Saudi Arabia and Turkey, so really from the region. Investments in Syria would not just be about commercial, but also strategic opportunity, essentially to lock Syria within their orbit. Economic rehabilitation is a massive challenge on its own, but outside the economy, there's still even bigger challenges, including domestic stability or instability, as case may be, sectarianism, full territorial control, lack thereof, and ongoing terrorism in parts of the country, all of which we think the Syrian Transitional Government will continue struggling with through this year. The Alawites, and that is the minority from which the previous Assad ruling house originated from, as well as the Druze, have both had armed conflicts, armed confrontations with government-affiliated forces, and this is likely to continue, especially by Alawites who still identify themselves with the previous Assad government and with Iran. And separately, the Druze, who are focused mainly in southern Syria, southern and southwestern Syria, are divided among themselves as to whether to go for full national integration, under the central government, of course, or whether to go for a federated structure with autonomy, or thirdly, to seek Israeli protection, essentially, with links to fellow Druze in the Golan Heights and inside Israel proper. And then, of course, there are the US-allied Kurds who maintain an autonomous administration covering mainly northeastern Syria, the site of much of Syria's energy reserves. And these Kurds are extremely wary of relinquishing that autonomy to the central government, which they remain very suspicious of. Other security challenges include Islamic State remnants inside the country, which the US military presence in the Kurdish-controlled areas have helped keep from significantly resurging over the past years, as well as separately Israeli military deployments and occasional airstrikes. Although I'd say that in recent weeks, there's been direct Israeli-Syrian dialogue between the governments of both countries, aimed, at this point at least, more at deconfliction and détente rather than normalization per se. Finally, an important factor is also what happens to the several thousand foreign fighters currently in Syria. The US, the Trump administration, has reportedly accepted just recently that these foreign fighters be incorporated into the Syrian armed forces, whereas it had previously insisted on them being removed. These foreign fighters made up the military mainstay in Hayat Tahrir al-Sham. This also relates to what we think will be the government's difficulties in smoothly unifying all the various armed factions within the security forces. These armed factions also include Turkish-backed forces that are mainly deployed in northern parts of the country. So in sum, we're talking massive challenges in Syria. But again, given in particular Western and Gulf re-engagement with Syria and the lifting of sanctions in recent weeks, this places the new government on a slightly better footing to get its act together.
So the U.S. administration seems to be cautiously committed to engaging with the Syrian government and overall supporting a wider de-escalation of conflict points in the region while engaging with Iran. We saw this directly at the beginning of May and at the end of U.S. military operations against the Houthi in Yemen. The Houthi may have established a ceasefire with the U.S. in the Red Sea, but do we think that reduces the threat to shipping? And what does it mean for access to the Suez Canal, Jacob?
Correct. The US and Houthi entered a ceasefire, and that has, as of time of speaking, so far been upheld. The Houthi has also continued to state that it will not attack international commercial shipping except for ships either owned by Israel or flying the Israeli flag. And according to our data, the Houthi hasn't carried out a successful attack on commercial shipping since December of last year, so December 2024. Okay, but what does this mean for the Red Sea shipping threat? It means that the Houthi has reduced its targeting base, but not that it has or will halt its Red Sea shipping attacks altogether. Despite the reduced target set, and despite the lack of confirmed attacks since last December, we still assess that there remains a severe risk for all vessels transiting the Red Sea, and this is due to the potential for misidentification. Now, if you were to look at the Houthis' targeting process, it very likely relies on inaccurate or incomplete open-source data, with our data suggesting that the majority of vessels targeted by the Houthi have actually had no clear affiliation with Israel or the US or UK. And despite the reduced attack rate on commercial shipping in the Red Sea, the Houthi has also been carrying out regular attacks targeting Israel. Notably, the Houthi fired a ballistic missile that landed inside the compound of Tel Aviv Ben Gurion Airport, only a few hundred meters from the main terminal. And in June, after Israeli airstrikes destroyed all remaining civilian aircraft under Houthi control at Sana'a International Airport, the Houthi announced that it would specifically target Israeli civilian and commercial aircraft. So what are we looking at? I mean, in terms of a longer-term forecast, is that the Houthi will likely continue to use its capability to target either Red Sea shipping, Israeli critical infrastructure, or Israeli aviation, as well as potentially returning to targeting of critical economic infrastructure in the Gulf, akin to what was seen in the period between 2019 and 2022. Why? As a leverage tool to pressure regional states, whether Israel or the Gulf states, into adopting policies that the group deems favorable. And that's likely to remain the case for as long as the group maintains territorial control in Yemen. For the Houthi group, I think it's important briefly to touch on likely Houthi motivation here, and we think there are two factors to consider. The first goal is likely regarding the sustenance of a domestic support base. The use of Houthis' drone and missile arsenal to pursue foreign policy objectives, especially where those policy objectives are very likely domestically popular, such as a ceasefire in Gaza or the allowance of further aid entry into Gaza, are likely deemed important for the maintenance of popular support under areas in Yemen where it maintains territorial and administrative control. But beyond that, and likely far more important for the Houthi group, is that these operations, where in the Red Sea or in the Gulf or in Israel, are also demonstrative of intent to project military power to support what we assess to be the Houthis' main goal, and that is to secure international recognition, or if not international recognition, at least regional recognition of its control in northern Yemen. So to return to your initial question regarding our outlook for the risk to Red Sea shipping, let's say in the year outlook, the longer that the US ceasefire holds, the lower the rate of Houthi Red Sea attacks will likely be. And there are also multiple triggers in the year outlook that would likely lead to a renewed, expanded Houthi targeting base, potentially including the US again or other international shipping. One of which we already discussed earlier in the podcast, and that relates to a regional war scenario between Iran, Israel, and the US, in which the Houthi would likely participate. The second would also likely relate to Israeli and US policy in the post-Gaza conflict stage.
Very interesting. Lots to watch there. So it's time for us to wrap up our conversation. Any final thoughts or key takeaways for our listeners as we do that? Kevin, let's come to you first.
Yeah, sure. While there are some vectors of instability in the region, there is a fair bit of opportunity as well, given the magnitude of change we've seen versus a year ago. But all this is also dependent, at least in part, on the key questions that we've been addressing on this podcast. Certainly an eventful region with impact far beyond its borders. And of course, we'll be tracking all this very closely with and for our client.
All right. Thank you, Kevin. And Jacob, how about you? Final thoughts, key takeaways?
Yeah, so I mean, out of the three principal topics that we talked about Iran-US nuclear negotiations, we talked about the Houthi, we talked about Syria. I think that in terms of the greatest regional impact, that would have to relate to the outcome of Iran's nuclear negotiations. It might not be the highest likelihood scenario, but that scenario of a regional war escalation would lead to significant disruption in Israel, in Iran, in the Gulf, across multiple Gulf states, and potentially even global supply chain disruption, specifically energy supply chain disruption. So I think really the focus here is on that low likelihood but high impact scenario.
Thank you so much, Kevin and Jacob, for taking the time to share your insights with us today. That concludes this episode of the Decisive Podcast. Until next time. Thank you for listening to the Decisive Podcast from S&P Global. Please subscribe and join us for next week's episode. Until then, stay curious and stay informed.